So today I'd like to talk about experimental fiction and see whether that's even a useful label at all to apply to literature. So in the science world, experimental is the sort of highest value in the sense of no theory can pass scrutiny unless it's been proved through repeated experiment to deliver the same results. And yet in literature, experimental is a term of abuse almost, it seems to me, in the sense of it represents either something that's not been thought through properly, that it's just a sort of a flyer from the author, that they don't know where they're going with it when they start out, which I don't see as a problem, because there are many conventional writers and conventional books have been produced like that, in the sense of, while many authors plan and have sort of graphs and post-it notes so that every detail is plotted out, there are plenty of writers who don't at all, and they just like to see where the story and the characters take them. So I think that's not useful to apply to experimental. And the other sort of pejorative sense of experimental is that it's not finished. It's a sort of a doodle. But again, to me that can't be true, in the sense of, if a writer sees fit for it to be published, to be exposed to sort of critical view by readers, then it's finished. It may not work, but it's finished. So I'm going to consider experimental fiction through one particular author, 1960s British author called B.S. Johnson, who himself regarded himself as avant-garde. So I've got a wedge of his books that I've read here. There's one missing because it's out of print and costs absolutely shed loads of money to get an out-of-print copy, so I haven't been able to afford that. And I'm going to start with not his first in chronological order, but my favourite, which is called The Unfortunates, which is a book. Only it isn't. It's a box with a book inside it, and it's a really interesting structure that he's done, because he specifies a first chapter, he specifies a last chapter, but then the rest, all of these, you can read in whatever order you want. So it's non-linear in the sense of the order of chapters is not prescribed for the reader. The reader can choose and decide what they are. And then at the very last, I'll just say what the book's about, I suppose. So the book itself is about a sports journalist who goes to a town to report on a football match. And it's a town he's very familiar with because he spent part of his life there. And one of his friends resided in that town, and this friend was dying of cancer. So the various chapters are made up either of what's happening to him on the day of the match, as he's getting there, he goes to a pub, buys some food, all this kind of stuff. And other bits are memories from his time with his dying friend, sparked off by things that are familiar to him in the town because he knows its geography. And then the very end is the actual match report the sports journalist produces on the match. And what's really interesting is, I think, the juxtaposition of that last match report with the rest of the stuff, because I think what Johnson's saying is that it's language fails us in the face of death and terminal disease and things like that, and loved ones who are parting from us. Language really doesn't cut the mustard. So that in the same similar way that when he's producing a match report about a football match, the language here also doesn't work, for the simple reason that how many different ways are there of describing a man kicking a ball into a goal? And that if you're covering 30 games a season, you've run out of different ways of saying the same things. The goalie saved it, or it flew into the net, and whatever metaphors you can use for that. So it's a book about despair, really. Obviously the despair of losing a friend, but it's about the despair of language. And it's a brilliant book. You have to be in the mood for it, because it's about someone dying of cancer, effectively. But it's a terrific read. And then we come to his other books. This is called Trawl, and it's about a voyage on a trawler ship to catch fish. And Johnson actually went on board a trawler to experience it for himself, because Johnson was obsessed with the tension between realism of life, trying to recapture what life is in its flesh and everything, but the nature of fiction can only take that so far, because it's painting it with words. It's not the thing itself. It's not living it. And the same as this is a book. No, it's not. It's a box with a book in it. So it's a similar thing. So he's trying to sort of create a realistic experience that he himself experienced. Is it experimental? I don't think so. It's worth reading, but it's not experimental. And then we come to Christy Mallory's Double Entry. Hilarious book. It's the first one of his I read and got me into him. It's a great read. Is it experimental? I don't think so. Again, it's a book that invites you, the reader, to be complicitous with a murderer, a guy who uses a sort of account keeping system. He is an accountant, and he uses an account keeping system of grudges and all that, and decides who he has to bump off. So it's hilarious. But it's similar in a way to that film Man Bites Dog, which is a documentary film crew following around a serial killer, and they get more and more sucked into his activities. So in the end, they participate in a murder as the camera crew. And this sort of invites a similar complicity on part of the reader, that we know what he's up to, and in a way we sort of egg him on by continuing reading. So highly recommended. There's a film about it which I haven't seen. Not about it, film of it. Is it experimental? I don't think so. Now, Albert Angelo. I don't think this book is experimental in the slightest until you come to one section on page 163. I'm going to read it for you. Part of the trouble, he thought, was that he lived and loved to live in an area of absolute architectural rightness, which inhibited his own originality and resulted in him being, oh, fuck all this lying. And that's, in one line, he's trying to subvert the whole of what's gone before, that he's built up this character called Albert Angelo, and he's sort of brought him to life, given him flesh. And then in the end, even Johnson thinks, no, this is nonsense. This is, it's fiction. This guy never existed. Why am I doing this, etc., etc. So a sort of reflexivity of the writer, which he wants to convey to the reader, to have similar sort of thought about, but not really experimental. And lastly, House Mother Normal, which I read last week. Again, great read. Very, very, very worthwhile read. It's basically a sort of a literary Rashomon, where it takes place in an old people's home, and it's 8 points of view of the same evening set of events of the 8 participants. And they have varying levels of dementia, so you get lots of different perspectives. And the last one is of the woman who's in charge of them. She's 42. She has her own agenda and stuff. So cracking stuff. But is it experimental? Well, I don't know whether he was, in the 60s, whether this had ever been done before, because my pre-knowledge of literature is not suffice to answer that. And it's certainly been done since, lots of times. David Peace is an author who did it in one of his Japanese, I think, Tokyo Year Zero, which looks at a sort of a terrorist act of poisoning, or a criminal act of poisoning, that actually happened in post-war Japan, and looks at it from all the different points of view of people involved, victims, the authorities, the American army who was still in place, who invested, all that sort of stuff. So it's not Johnson's fault, perhaps, that it's no longer experimental. It's something that we've read quite countless times ourselves. And that's the point about experimental fiction, is you can only do it once, because once it's done, doing it again, it's no longer new or experimental. So this, to me, definitely was experimental. These, much less so. And the point about this is, it is one of a kind, because if anyone else does this sort of thing and does a book inside a box kind of thing, in order to have non-linearity, that cannot be experimental, because Johnson beat them to it. Now, it's possible to have non-linear texts where the reader chooses the order, particularly in our digital world, where you just, if you provide lots of hyperlinks. There's a book just come out by Joanna Walsh called Seed, which you're supposed to read on your phone, and again, the reader sort of chooses the order. So again, it's non-linear. So it is genuinely different, I think, in its packaging, but it's doing very similar things to this. So we have these elements of non-linearity, of the author talking directly to the reader and saying, think about this work of fiction that you're reading. It's a work of fiction. What does that mean to you and your real life? All these sorts of things. But now you're starting to get that in quite conventional books, not in so-called experimental works. non-linear fiction, characters who are unreliable narrators or narrators directly addressing the reader, outside of the action or whatever. We have that, much more widely than we did when Johnson and other people were writing. So it's not experimental anymore. I think it is possible. There are small areas that you can explore, I think, still that haven't been touched. But once a writer does them, again, they're done. They yield the results that they yield. But to then follow up by doing more of the same, either by that writer or other writers, it's not experimental because that ground's being covered. So I really don't see the value of the word experimental. And I'm not talking about in terms of the negative associations with it of, as I said before, of, being, sort of not being thought through or not being pre-planned or not being seen through to the end and all those. No, I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about there is almost no experimental fiction, and anything that is can only be done once. So therefore, is it useful categorized? So Johnson has a great body of work. That, as I said, I believe is hugely experimental. These less so. Is he an experimental writer? Well, compared to the mainstream, he's certainly unconventional. And he's sort of pushing in directions that not very many writers cover. But he's not, I don't think his body of work, his oeuvre, is experimental. And that's no criticism because I really like him. So it just comes back to this conclusion that I'm forced to draw, even though it's one that I work in myself, although I don't call my work experimental for the reasons I hope are obvious now. But I just don't think it's a very useful label anymore. So till next time.